Hello and welcome to the Circus of Oregon, where we share, discuss, and debate the political topics that affect Oregonians in their everyday lives. And we are your hosts, Nick and Taylor. Today, we will begin by giving a detailed overview in the history of the death penalty in the Beaver State. Now, we will give you all the facts to get started and the rich history lesson needed to better understand this polarizing topic. So, to begin, the death penalty was not originally recognized in the Oregon Constitution. In 1864, first-degree murder statute was adopted, and in 1864 through 1903, vested in county sheriffs the public was allowed to witness said executions. In 1903, Oregon legislature made amendments, so the executions had to be done at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, Oregon. And at this point, public attendance was also restricted at the time, but in 1904 through 1914, 24 men were hung using the death penalty. And now I'll hand it over to Taylor.
In 1914, the death penalty was repealed with 50.04% of the vote. This created Article 136 of the Oregon Constitution. In 1920, Article 137 through 38 was approved with a 56% vote restating the death penalty. Between 1920 and 1931, there were 15 hangings. But in the 1930s, they switched to lethal gas. And following that switch, there were 17 chamber executions. On November 3rd, 1964, the death penalty was again repealed. On November 5th, 1964, 2 days afterwards, Governor Mark Hatfield, who was a Republican, had 3 executions, including the only women to be sentenced to death. In 1978, Ballot Measure 8 reinstituting capital punishment by lethal gas. With a 64% vote, this amended ORS 163.115 and created ORS 163.116. In 1984, Measure 6 created Article 140, which exempted the capital punishment from Article 115 through 16 of the Oregon Constitution. This 56% vote reinstated the death penalty. In 1984, Measure 7 amended ORS 163.150, which required a separate sentencing hearing before a jury for aggravated murder. On May 16, 1907, was the most recent Oregon execution. For the stats between 1904 and 1994, there was 115 people sentenced to death, of which 58 were executed. And of those 58, someone is not nice. 55 of those were white, and 3 were black. And again, only 1 was a woman. The ages were 17 to 67. In 2011, Governor John Kitzhaber issued a moratorium, which Kate Brown has continued. And so far, so has Tina Kotek.
So at this point in this podcast, we're going to begin discussing more of the back and forth that's gone on between the years and really the political statements on both sides of the aisle. Because, it's quite in-depth and quite a lot to try to get done in such a little amount of time. However, first we're going to begin with botched executions. And this has been a great reason for why the states have been moving away from the death penalty in recent years. Mostly the past 40 years, to be exact. between witnesses and the families of the victims, no one has really come to the conclusion that the trauma that one undergoes when experiencing or seeing these executions is really considered worth it. And another very huge problem we're experiencing now is the costs associated with these. So, for example, legal processes can take up to millions of dollars. It's approximately $1.12 million just for the death penalty itself, which is considerably above, about double what it would take to just house the inmates until their eventual death, on average. And then, in general, now that we've become more of a money-based society, right, and also more sensitive to the thought of others dying, it's the morale across the U.S., but especially in Oregon, has been more sympathetic towards death penalty victims. And we've largely moved away from this idea that because someone committed a wrong, that they must now be punished for that within death themselves, because we don't apply that punishment to any other crime. This idea can be used in a lot of different political spheres, but pretty famously, a few Oregon congressmen had said in a statement that they believed, using theft as an example, right? We don't punish people by taking away something they own because they stole something from somebody else, right? So this idea is, death penalty only applies to this one type of criminal act. And so we've definitely largely been moving away from this. And I'm going to move it over to Taylor to talk about whatever she would like to.
So if you noticed in the stats, I stated with the race distribution, it is important to keep in mind that Oregon had a exclusion law for African Americans and Black people in general up until the 1920s, and then even then they weren't moving here because of all the racism. So the numbers are a bit skewed, so we do have to keep that in mind, because a lot of the reasons for taking death penalty off the books is because of the inherent racism of a lot of juries. So I feel like that is something that listeners should keep in mind when discussing and listening to this topic, especially in Oregon, which in its history was considered to be a white utopia.
So I guess more largely in general, what we've discovered in the time we've had to spend researching this topic is that there is an overwhelming majority of people now that don't feel confident in killing or feeling like they need to promote the killing of criminals because they at one point had committed murder. And we're not going to go into this in this episode. However, the court cases themselves have a lot of interesting issues with them. One of them being that in Oregon, it was not common, but if someone was on death row and they were, ready to be executed, right? If there wasn't very solidified evidence, right? It was he said, she said type evidence, and nothing was very clear. The people began losing confidence that the government could accurately judge whether or not they should be executed. And so then, more and more stories started coming out of people who were impoverished or people of color that started kind of weeding into this death penalty issue. And so now there's been a huge overturn of how we approach these cases, which is also a very interesting time in Oregon right now, as we just got past, big riots when there was people dying in the streets for, a considerable number of months. And even though all of that has happened, public outrage hasn't considerably been an issue since. So public overview of this has been not incredibly positive. We don't have a big reason to. Okay, Jesus.
So sorry, folks.
All right, here's the bigger idea here. Basically, the death penalty has really just given people another reason to not trust the government, which is exactly why they don't happen as often as they used to. On both sides of the aisle, whether even in a Democrat-run state, right? Democrats do not trust the government just the same as Republicans don't in whatever state they're in. There is a clear divide now where even though people say, it's worth killing the person because they murdered someone, say, 20, 30 years ago. Well, not only is that becoming less and less economically viable, but morally, we're in a very interesting place here in America, and making that decision for someone else has become increasingly inappropriate, especially for the government to make that decision. Because even though we do have our prosecutors that are trying to do that, it just doesn't play over well. And we, in general, don't believe that helps with the crime we see every day on the streets. So it's something worth considering. And again, we're not trying to sway anyone's opinion on this topic. However,
we're just trying to give the facts.
Exactly. And so we tell you this to make your own opinion, your own judgment, but I'm not going to lie and say that part of the show isn't about opinion, because it is. We are two college students who are probably malinformed and wildly naive. However...
and misinformed.
That as well. But the way we see it, in my opinion, there's really no reason for this issue to be so polarizing. I think America has really already decided that it's not the thing we need to move forward. And it's kind of ridiculous if you think about it. What's really strange, though, is that, especially here in Oregon, there's been debates with lethal injection, things like that. And the conservative opinion, which is typically limiting government, not letting the government control you, your life, how you live, has been the voice of enabling these death penalty procedures, which is really sort of against the conservative stance. And so this way of thinking has really gone pretty backwards.
And another point is that when people, sometimes these murders are, like, again, they have lack of evidence, but they also don't allow people to change. I mean, some people make really stupid decisions, and it could end up costing someone else's life. But if they're given the chance to repay what they did, not by them giving their lives, but through actions or gaining support for whatever state they were in, like mental state, like mental health issues is a big part of it. So having them advocate for more mental health resources.
I guess that brings up a larger point too, that we aren't here to tell you what to think, but if there's anything we can get across, it's that finding unconventional ideas to solve unconventional problems is the best thing that we could try to give to you on this topic, because it's not white and black. There is no solidified one answer for this, but we invite you, like, if you can share your opinion on some topic, please let us know. Like, tell us your opinions on this. We want to be more insightful, and we want to be able to share the most accurate information possible.
All right. And that was the first episode of the Circus of Oregon. And we were your hosts, Taylor
and Nick.
Please be tuned in next week for the second episode. And stay tuned.